Welcome to our business track of the Data Science Salon YouTube channel. In this presentation, we have Leondra James, Manager Analytics and Operations at Saatchi. And Saatchi is a global full-service advertising agency and creative communications network, and they're asking really interesting questions as she shares how they're leveraging data to answer them. Leondra shares a broad overview of predicting advertising initiatives, resources, and their respective allocations. Enjoy.
All right, thank you everyone. Today I'm going to be talking a little bit, as Jeremy already mentioned, about the operations that go on within an agency, specifically the agency that I work for, which is Saatchi & Saatchi, and talking a little bit about our operations initiatives and how we've tried to implement predictive analytics in a way to be more proactive about how we plan our campaigns. So just to tell you a little bit about myself, I'm the Manager of Analytics and Operations at Saatchi & Saatchi, and I still very much consider myself to be new there. I started in January. My experience in general isn't necessarily in advertising. I come from more of the entertainment side background, working on the studio side, having worked for Fox and Lionsgate and a few other organizations. But I'm really excited about my opportunity at Saatchi & Saatchi. So my undergrad, believe it or not, and I always love to mention this to an audience just because there might be someone who was in my predicament at the time. I don't traditionally come from a quantitative background. My undergraduate was in, there was a liberal arts program called Music and Business, so about 60% of what I did was music related. Went to school on a violin scholarship, and then the other 40% was business. So no statistics, no mathematics, nothing like that. That all came later. My master's degree is at Carnegie Mellon and Heinz College in entertainment industry management with a focus in business analytics. And I'm recently just found out that I got accepted into University of the Cumberlands, and I'll be doing a PhD in information technology. And just to give a little bit of interesting facts about myself, just because I like to humanize myself and not just talk about analytics, I'm into gaming, I love music, hiking, camping, RPGs, and football. And I'm pretty basic, I'm from the Midwest, so I like anything pumpkin spice related, autumn, rain, things that don't happen in LA. So in order to sort of get into a little bit about what I do at Saatchi and the different initiatives, analytics initiatives that we've tried to undertake, I want to tell you a little bit about the organization and a little bit about our relation to our client. So Saatchi & Saatchi is a global full-service advertising agency and creative communications network. So to kind of further explain that, we're sort of a one-stop full house for everything related to launching a campaign for a product for an organization. So that can be anything from the marketing analytics, web analytics, to planning and idea management, creating the commercials, shooting the commercials, hiring the talent for the commercials, things of that sort. Our slogan is nothing is impossible. So it's a really cool organization. It's a very collaborative place where people like myself who work in operations can go to someone in marketing and get information that I need. There's just sort of this attitude where anything is possible if we have the data and if we have the resources. Saatchi & Saatchi is a subsidiary of the Publicis Group. So that's sort of our parent company. They are, I believe, the third largest communications conglomerate, and they own numerous other agencies aside from Saatchi & Saatchi, and they're based out of Paris. Saatchi & Saatchi's headquarters, however, are in London, and we have over 114 offices in 76 different countries, over 6,500 people on our staff, and we have award-winning content, including over 36 Lions at the Cannes Film Festival, which is really cool. So they really pride themselves in their work, and I'll show you an example later today, or in a couple of minutes actually, of one of our most recent productions. And we have various clients, and I'll talk a little bit about the specific client that my department works under. But some of the clients that we have here are T-Mobile, HSBC, General Mills, P&G, Lexus, Expedia, Visa, et cetera. So we have a clientele across a number of different industries, not just vehicles, for example, or financial products. So the office that I work from, and at least one other additional office, we are all sort of focused on the Toyota client. So as you all know, they're a Japanese multinational automotive manufacturer. They're headquartered in Japan, and they're the largest automotive manufacturer in the world. 6th largest company in the world revenue-wise in September 2018. Largest listed company in Japan by market capitalization and revenue. World's market leader in sales of hybrid electric vehicles. And some of their products include hybrid, all-electric, hydrogen fuel cell, SUVs, trucks, and luxury vehicles. And they produce about over 10 million vehicles per year. And I actually researched a little bit more about Toyota in preparation for this presentation, and I also learned that they were actually the first automotive company to actually produce over 10 million cars in a year. So that's pretty cool. Okay, and also I want to show you an example of some of our work. So in a second here, I think they're going to show you a video. Okay. So the one thing that I do like about working for an advertising agency, in addition to some other things, but it's actually really cool learning how they make some of these products. This might sound really dumb, but a lot of their products in terms of like things you see in magazines and stuff, or the cars like in the snow and everything, I always thought they actually shot that somewhere in Alaska or something, like actually in the snow. But it's all just computers, like it's all designed. So I always thought that was cool, and I always like showing people our work because I think it's really good quality. So to talk a little bit about our ad operations, we have a single ad initiative which entails countless details. That's interesting. Okay, so the oversight that I oversee is TMNA, which is our Toyota Motor Corporation client. And I oversee all of the analysis related to our operations for work that comes out of Los Angeles, actually it's in Torrance, and the work that comes out of Dallas, Texas, which is where our sister location is. We have, at least currently, over 80 different initiatives across multiple departments, roles, and employees in 2 different cities. Hundreds of thousands of job IDs over the past 5 fiscal years, millions of media and production budget spend. And we leverage multiple data sets across various different locations. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. But basically leveraging operations research, process improvement, and predictive modeling to help answer some pretty interesting questions. So to talk a little bit more about the data, we have hundreds of employees, and a lot of the data that I particularly touch has to do with the hours that certain employees spend on certain projects, the different initiatives that they're for, so it can be Camry, RAV4, Supra, and the different types and subtypes, which are sort of different hierarchical levels of information regarding a project. So that project can be for a department in idea management, the type can be account stewardship, and the subtype can be relationship management meetings. So there's various different hierarchical levels of information and features. So formally, prior to sort of the role that I occupy, there wasn't really a formal way to utilize data in a predictive sense. And a lot of the things that we do has basically been used in a naive way of forecasting different things that occur at our agency. And to talk a little bit more about the initiatives that we have, this doesn't only just talk about like models like Camry, RAV4, Highlander, but as well as non-model initiative too. So for instance, we handle Toyota's Global Olympics campaigns. We also handle sort of the Let's Go Places moniker that you've probably heard in a lot of Toyota commercials, in-market initiatives, things of that sort. And as I've already mentioned, these projects are split across multiple initiatives, types, subtypes. Within those types of subtypes, we have different categories, different complexity levels in terms of if the project is very difficult, if it's somewhat simple, or if it's intermediate. Different frequencies, so that would be if this is something that we do every month, every day, every quarter, and different fiscal years. So we try to leverage data that goes back as far as feasibly possible, but when it comes to things like forecasting, the most recent information is going to be the most dangerous for our purposes. And also the further back we go in terms of data, it tends to be a little bit dirtier and a little bit more difficult to clean up. So we've kind of arbitrarily chosen a certain year to start at. The projects that we do are supported by, in addition to hours and just man labor, it's also supported by media budgets and production budgets. So like, for instance, the commercial you saw, we had a production budget for that, but we also have a media budget in terms of getting that sort of advertising out there. The data that we have relating to these projects are typically pretty sparse. The historical data comes from across multiple resources, both active and retired. So Saatchi has sort of implemented numerous ERP systems throughout the years prior to my role. And so there's a lot of inconsistencies in terms of taxonomies and in terms of just what we used to call things across the years. So there's a lot of sort of cleaning that up, making a lot of assumptions in terms of what do we want to call something when it had a different name in one year versus a new year. And so one major task on my desk is sort of imputing an ad campaign launch dates. Historically, Saatchi didn't really, formally, we didn't really keep track of when a campaign actually launched. Like, that information is floating around somewhere, but it's not necessarily tracked in a very formal manner. So part of what I do is sort of like a time series analysis or a trend analysis to see when we see different peaks and troughs in activities for certain projects, and then labeling sort of the launch period, the start and end date for those campaigns. And as I mentioned, we deal with multiple taxonomies from a department level, a master department level, which is a little bit higher up in the hierarchy. We have shells, which we now call initiatives, master shells, different departments and roles, even down to the employee's name in some cases, which, believe it or not, is actually one of the most time-consuming things I have to deal with to some aspect, just because people's names change all the time, people get married, they spell their name differently, they get a nickname, you know, and just kind of cleaning up the data and normalizing their names. So there's like one Sally Mae. I don't know why I thought of Sally Mae, but there's like one Sally Mae and not like a Sally L. Mae or like a Sally Mae dash her employee ID. So there's just a lot of dirty data and cleaning that up. And as I mentioned before, dealing with multiple dollar spends. So I also work a little bit with finance if I need more information pertaining to that. So getting to the organizational challenges, one of our biggest challenges is that, or at least prior to my current role, is sort of having a limited quantitative planning strategy. So as I mentioned before, we really want to get on top of using this data in a smart way to sort of cut back the time it takes for scoping managers, or what we call scope leads, to tell us how much time they think it's going to take for a project per person on their team, per project ID, per department, et cetera. As I mentioned before, there was sort of a naive forecasting method that was used. People just sort of having the information in their head and knowing, oh, I know back in 2015, we spent this much time on this project, which is, you know, I guess it's worked somewhat effectively historically, but they definitely want to be able to quantify that in a smarter manner. As I mentioned before, data in multiple locations, data structuring inefficiencies in multiple taxonomies, unlabeled data, which we'll talk about in a second in terms of unlabeled initiatives, dirty, incomplete, and missing data. It's very common, and lots of text data, especially for project descriptions, which we'll also talk about. So to sort of give you like a visual example of what our taxonomy looks like, for our initiative, we'll have something like Global Olympics or in-market or multi-model Let's Go places, or we'll have a model like Camry, RAV4, Supra. And then on an account or on a type level, we'll have something like account management. The subtype would be meetings, so that's what they're doing at that time. The departments for that subtype would be idea management. And then we have various other features, like as I mentioned before, job descriptions, budgets, complexity, frequency, cost, so actual spend, location, office, if it's in LA or if it's in Dallas, et cetera. And so some really interesting questions that management has sort of proposed based on this information, now that it's sort of gathered in one place, is, I know it's cute, how to improve ad operations planning strategy. How can we use our resources more efficiently? How are initiatives similar or dissimilar? What can we expect to spend on a new ad campaign that we've never done before? How much work will a new ad initiative require? Are we meeting spend and human resource goals for particular projects? And who specializes in what, and how else may we utilize those people who specialize in certain areas? And do we have overworked resources or departments? So some of the business cases that I've sort of encountered thus far, and this is probably the most, the biggest project that I'm working on, is predicting human resource hours, doing trend and time series analysis, so ETS or decomposition analysis to look at the trends of spend or hours for certain projects. Anomaly detection of project resources. This is more of a project geared towards looking at when something has been entered incorrectly, or somebody spent way more than they were supposed to, or if there were way too many hours spent on something. Modeling ad initiative similarities, so using clustering techniques to sort of look at how the certain things that we do are similar, so that when we get a new campaign, we can make certain underlying assumptions regarding how this new project might look. And then two projects that I'm going to very high level, very briefly discuss are initiative labeling, which uses text classification with the job descriptions I previously mentioned, and business process analysis. So looking at our process mapping, and resource activity matrices. So the first example is project labeling. As I mentioned before, we have a lot of missing data. And one thing that is very important that we don't always have is initiative. So that's the thing where I mentioned this is under Camry, this is under RAV4, and we need to sort of label that. Traditionally, we had a taxonomy, but it depends on sort of the year that we're looking at in terms of how we've labeled certain things. It's the same thing. Some project initiatives labeling are based on intuition. I noticed when I was first working on this project, I sort of just read through the job description and I said, this seems like this was for Camry, but a lot of times it's not always very clear because you'll read something regarding Camry and Global Olympics. So you're like, which one do I put it under? Because it can only be under one initiative. Some labeling is intuitive but requires manual categorization. Manual labeling requires a review of job description, as I mentioned. And to expedite this process, I use sort of NLP techniques and classification. So basically what I did was, based on these data quality and integrity issues such as missing data, multiple taxonomies, inconsistent assumptions, typos and misspellings, for instance, or just the way things are just expressed differently. So something could be MMLGP, or it could also be expressed as multi-model let's go places. It can also be expressed as multi-no-dash model let's go places. There's a number of ways that you can express that one initiative. And because of the manual data entry, which is a lot of sort of inefficient way of using my time, what I decided to do was to build a text classification model where I modeled on the labeled and correct data. And what we did was we looked at the project descriptions as well as FTE roles and budgets as features, and using cross-validation and using our model, we determined that with looking at term frequency, inter-document frequency, instead of just term frequency, which I'll explain in a minute, we were able to more accurately and more autonomously label different initiatives. And to talk a little bit why we went with the term frequency and document frequency is because there are some words that you'll see in a job description that should be weighted more heavier because they're less frequent or more rare. So for instance, just so you can kind of see what we're talking about from a job description, and this is completely hypothetical, and usually they're way longer than this, but it might say, meeting to discuss commercial idea for RAV4's launch during the Global Olympics. And so understanding that when we see Global Olympics, that should supersede the importance of RAV4. That's why we use term frequency, inter-document frequency. And so the processing for this was tokenization, getting all the words, stemming the words, removing spaces and numbers, looking at, like I said, the different methods of sort of quantifying weighting, reducing sparsity, and doing some EDA to further understand which words are more important than others, how often certain words come up per initiative, and looking at the distribution of the budgets per initiative. So for instance, RAV4, for instance, might have, on average, way more spend than something like the 86 model. So that's a really strong indicator of initiative. And so using grid search, we tune the model, and then we have predictions, but with those predictions, we always go back and obviously look at like the F1 score or something like that, and then understanding, where has it performed not as well as we would have hoped, looking at the trend resources to understand if there's something missing in terms of spin somewhere and relabeling it correctly. So next steps for this project is model optimization, experimenting with different models, recommend internal systematic rules of thumb for job description writing practices, implementing agency-wide guidelines for future job classifications, exploring additional features, as I mentioned before, other models, also improving the ETL of multiple data sources so that it's more autonomous and reproducible, and anticipating the growth of our data and scale. And then I'll very briefly go over our last example because I think I'm running out of time here. But this one's a little bit more exploratory in nature. It's looking at our business process analysis from data that comes from multiple ERP systems, and then mapping out sort of different attributes like resources or spend, looking to see where we find project bottlenecks, where are certain projects getting held up, looking at the workflow, what is typically the first step in a project, what's the last step, and how much time or resources we spend in each one of those steps. Looking at activity matrices to provide insights, resource specialization, resource relative and relative frequency, and looking at brain drain risk, detail of extended project turnover time, absolute relative frequencies, trace explorer, and then looking at control flow, project life, and project life cycle analysis. So this is just sort of examples of what this might look like. So on the left, we have resource frequency. So looking at how much time, for instance, a person is working versus another, or looking at which projects certain people spend time on, and from there you can sort of assume that a certain person has a certain specialization. And then you can also look at sort of the flow of hours or the flow of budget, whatever the actual metric is, to understand where things are getting held up, where we can actually interfere with this process and prevent brain drain, and just basically making our projects flow easier and more efficiently. And this is also looking at, and this is totally hypothetical, but looking at activity frequency across different departments or across different activities, for instance. So the next step in this, I'm kind of like flying through this to get through it in time, but to standardize process reporting, to track the KPIs of these process performances, especially after providing a recommendation on those, doing root cause analysis to see where these inefficiencies came in the first place, implement data quality measures, and that's it. Thank you. Thank you. This is my contact information. I checked to see if we were hiring for any data-related roles. This is the only one I saw, at least for LA. So we are hiring a chief data officer. So if you are interested, feel free to contact me, email me, or check me out on LinkedIn. I'm the only Leondra James as far as I'm aware of on LinkedIn. So feel free to reach out.
That was a presentation by Leondra James, Manager Analytics and Operations at Saatchi. Leondra provided insights on how Saatchi leverages data to answer interesting questions and shared an overview of predicting advertising initiative resources. If you enjoyed this presentation, please feel free to subscribe to our YouTube channel below. Thanks!